Hey everybody, today we're talking about engine vacuum and why that's important. I'll just say, as in many of these topics, I see things come across the channel. I get a question where somebody says, can you tell me about why do we have vacuum and what difference does it make? And as we've been going through some of the engine diagnostics, I talk about vacuum, I talk about MAP, and I can tell from some of the responses that it's a foggy issue, I'll call it. So today we're going to dig into it a little bit. And maybe quite a bit, actually. I hope it's not more than you can stand, but I'm going to try to go through it deep enough that it makes sense to you. We're going to go through a number of topics. One of them is just, what is vacuum? How do you define it? How do you measure it? What units would you use? How does an engine make vacuum? Where does it come from? Why does it get higher? Why does it get lower? Why should we care? If you got a vacuum leak, so what, right? What difference does it make? And then the last one, there's a related topic which is called MAP, manifold absolute pressure, which is related to vacuum. So we'll talk about that a little bit, because the two are like flip sides of a coin, right? And you need to understand the difference between the two, because most modern engines talk in MAP instead of in vacuum. So first off, hey, what's vacuum? Well, the way I'm going to define it for the sake of what we're doing around engines, it's an air pressure, in this case inside the intake manifold or behind the throttle. It's air pressure that's less than atmospheric pressure. If we didn't have an engine, you can still have vacuum, right? You can pull vacuum on a container and take the air out of it. Then that says, well, okay, so what's atmospheric pressure? I mean, around us, right, we have air pressure. We don't sense it. We don't know that we're being pushed on. But at sea level, roughly standard conditions, and for you, those of you who might be scientists, technical engineers and that, I'm going to try to round some things off so that I don't lose everybody in the weeds with deep minutia. So sometimes you're going to see me with numbers, round them or blend them a little bit. My example would be here, sea level standard. It depends on what organization's deciding and defining what the standard is, because atmospheric pressure changes from minute to minute, from day to day, by small amounts. And there are some standard definitions. And I'm going to use like 14.7 is pretty much standard. For the sake of what is vacuum and how does it affect our engines, I'm going to try to do some rounding off to make it a little easier to go. Standard is 14.7 approximately. Inches of mercury, it's around 29.92. In metric terms, it's usually in bars. It's a little over 1 bar, or a little over 100 kilopascals. When we talk about vacuum, we most often talk about vacuum in inches of mercury. Why is that? What's an inch of mercury, right? Why are you concerned about that? Well, once upon a time, long, long ago, before we had fancy technical instruments, and people were, scientists were working on, this a couple centuries ago, working on understanding atmospheric pressure. The first barometer that measured atmospheric pressure, which you could use for weather forecasting, which is why today in the United States we still use inches of mercury for the barometer. If you took a tube and a closed end tube and you filled it with mercury, and you put the open end of the tube into a bucket or a container filled with mercury, that mercury, because of its weight, would drop down and create a low pressure area down to a vacuum. Because mercury is a pretty heavy metal. So it'll drop until it gets a vacuum that's kind of like equal to its weight, equal to the weight of the column below it. If you had a bucket or a container filled with mercury that has atmospheric pressure pushing down on it, and you measured from the surface of that of the mercury in the bowl up to the top, you'd measure about 29.92 inches, give or take a little bit. For many, many years, mercury manometers were used to measure air pressure. Today we have mechanical gauges and you have electronic sensors and so forth, but a couple centuries ago this was the prevalent method, and the use of mercury was a pretty much of a standard, and it's precise because mercury doesn't change its properties very much. It's a liquid metal, and so anybody could take mercury anywhere on the face of the earth and put it in a tube and measure the local pressure. If they weren't at sea level, they would get a different pressure. Mercury, inches of mercury, became a pretty standard measure of barometric pressure and also of vacuum. If you can pull a pressure down to 29.92, if somebody's working on an air conditioning system, when they put in a new air conditioning system with plumbing, before they put refrigerant in it, they pull it down with a vacuum pump down to almost a complete vacuum. Sometimes you'll let that pump run for hours to get every last little bit of air out. And if you measured that pressure on the vacuum pump, again, it depends on your altitude, but you're going to be around 29.9. Then in modern times, we got mechanical gauges. And this particular mechanical gauge, this is one that I used back in one of my earlier videos for exhaust back pressure. This old gauge, I bought this one, I was probably about 17 or 18 years old to diagnose one of my engines. I've been carrying this thing around for 40 plus years. It's a pressure vacuum gauge. So on one side it measures low pressure so you can measure your fuel pump output, and the opposite side measures vacuum, and it gives you kind of a red and green. So you can use this to help diagnose your engine. So what does vacuum mean? How do we address that? Picture that you have an empty can, an empty soup can, right? That's sealed up. And you're at sea level, so your air pressure is about 14.7 or 29.92, and there's no air in it. You'll have a vacuum of 29.92. That's the definition. It's how far are you below atmospheric pressure. If you have a partially filled container, take that same soup can and it's 14.7 on the outside, and like I talked about air conditioning a minute ago, you put a vacuum pump that can pull out the air, and it starts pulling it down, and it gets you from 14.7 to 10 psi-A, and psi-A means absolute. There's also a gauge pressure, and essentially when we're reading vacuum on a vacuum gauge, it's a gauge pressure. It's a difference from atmospheric pressure rather than what is atmospheric pressure. So I go from 14.7 or 29.92, so here on this chart, here's 30, that's atmospheric pressure, 29.92, and I go down to 20, I'll have pulled 10 inches of vacuum. I'll have pulled out, here's my little chart down here, I've pulled out 4.7 psi worth of air, or 9.62, roughly 10 inches of mercury has come out, and so I have an absolute pressure of 10 or an absolute pressure of 20 inches of mercury still in the can, partially filled. That makes sense? Now I'm going to switch from just a can. Let's go over to an engine. What is it? And this is a kind of an idealized single cylinder engine, right? Usually we got 4 cylinders, 6s, 8s, whatever. So you have multiple cylinders. The concepts work the same. One thing to understand about gasoline engines is that they're throttled. And you have a plate that blocks off the intake air. And so the engine, if you didn't have a throttle, the engine would blow itself up. Because as airflow comes in, fuel will get fed to match the airflow, the engine will make more power, and it will take off and go faster and faster and faster until it blows up. Not a very good situation. So the whole point in a gasoline engine, standard internal combustion engine, is that you have generally a homogeneous charge. I know there's stratified charge engines, but typically what you got is a homogeneous charge where you're bringing in air and you're mixing it with fuel, and the fuel air mix should be consistent, equal, well blended, so that you get a good ignition at the spark plug. And what keeps the engine from running away is the throttle. You close the throttle and vacuum builds up against the piston and slows it down, and keeps the engine at the speed that you want. Here I'm going to just picture when you got an engine at closed throttle at idle, and here's your intake with a throttle blade that shuts off or regulates the air coming into the intake manifold. If it's fuel injected here, you got a fuel injector. It's got two valves. There's your exhaust. You got a spark plug in the center. And here's your piston and cylinder. This is like your vacuum pump. And so, closed throttle. On the intake stroke of the engine, the exhaust valve will be closed, the intake valve will be open, the piston will come down like this. And because it's pulling that piston down, it's trying to draw air through against this closed throttle plate. And I know if you have a fuel injected engine, you've got an IAC valve also, but let's just stay with a throttle plate, right? If your throttle is closed, you're sucking against it and trying to pull air into the cylinder, and the air is expanding and its pressure is dropping because the air is expanding. Now if you stop, you're going to have air bleed around this throttle plate and it'll fill that cylinder back up again and the vacuum will go away. But while it's pulling down, you'll have vacuum, lowered pressure or vacuum, formed in that cylinder. And a typical V8 engine, that vacuum's typically between 15 and 21 inches. There are a lot of factors that go into that. But, in my day, pre-fuel injection, 20 or 21 inches of mercury at an idle for a normal standard engine was a really nice place to be. Now at wide open throttle, you open that throttle plate up, and same conditions. I'm going to have an intake valve open and an exhaust valve closed, and on the intake stroke, it's going to go click, 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 till it gets to the bottom, and it's trying to pull air in, but because that throttle's open, and the air's trying to rush in behind it, you can't get near as much vacuum. And so typically at wide open throttle, you'll get, depends on your engine, right? Could be 0, but typically it's going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4 inches of mercury. And we'll leave supercharged and turbocharged engines out of it. That'll influence this too. But for a non-boosted normal engine at wide open throttle, you're going to be somewhere in that range. What if you have a vacuum leak? So you got an operating engine. For an operating engine, stoichiometric or optimum air-fuel ratio for emissions and so forth, the amount of fuel that will use all the air in the cylinder is normally 14.7 to 1. Again, give or take. When you're running closed loop on your computer-controlled engine, typically that's what they're aiming for, is no leftover oxygen, no leftover fuel. Assuming you've got a computer-controlled fuel-injected engine, you've got a mass airflow sensor that's measuring the air coming into the engine. You've got a manifold absolute pressure sensor that's measuring the pressure. Essentially, in another set of units, it's measuring the vacuum. As your piston is heading up and down, now, let me back up for just a second. Because it's this is picturing a single cylinder engine, that pressure is going to pulsate. When you get a 4-cylinder, the pulsations are less. When you get a V8, the pulsations are even smaller. So if you were looking at this on a gauge, the gauge is going to wiggle because each one of these cylinders is coming down, it's making vacuum, and then it's closing off. That intake valve will close, and then the air is going to try to come through the throttle plate and fill the intake manifold. So you'll have, vacuum isn't a steady number. If you have a vacuum leak, what does that mean to you, right? Well, what it means is that you're letting air into the intake system without measuring it. You say, well, so what if I don't measure it? Well, in order to control the engine to get to 14.7, the mass airflow sensor, I'm going to go all the way to the bottom here. Some engines have a mass airflow sensor. My 85 Camaro has a mass airflow sensor. It does not have a MAP sensor. Other engines, when I talked about the speed density engines, they typically don't have a mass airflow sensor. They have a MAP sensor, and they measure the pressure in the intake manifold and try to calculate, it's a very sophisticated calculation. They try to measure how much airflow, how much air is coming in the intake by how much pressure there is, knowing how big the valves are, knowing how big the cylinders are, knowing how fast the engine is going, and then knowing what this pressure is, they can guess pretty close, estimate, shouldn't use the word guess, they estimate the airflow. And then in an engine that's got closed loop, they refine that using the oxygen sensor. They can refine it with closed loop, and between that and the MAP sensor, you can be really close. Now, most, I would say, OBD2 engines today that I've seen have a mass airflow sensor and they have a MAP sensor, and the two of them are kind of, talking to each other in the computer and checking on each other. A couple months ago, I had a video up here for my son's Buick where the MAP sensor failed, and the MAP sensor was, because it failed at essentially a wide open throttle condition, and even though the mass airflow sensor wasn't showing a lot of air, it essentially was overriding this, and it was telling the computer, telling the fuel injectors, put in lots of fuel because you're at wide open throttle. Even though the throttle was closed and the airflow was low, this broken MAP sensor, somewhere in the logic, was going, hey, pour in gas, which it was doing. And when we unplugged that so that it said, oh, it's a failed sensor, and it went and put in a default backup value, that value was probably based on what's the throttle position, the engine speed, and MAF, then the engine was capable of running again until we put a new sensor in it. In any case, we back up again to the, vacuum leaks can come in from gaskets in the intake manifold, gaskets in the throttle body, vacuum hoses that get a crack in them, the brake booster. Vacuum's a really cool thing, right? For years and years, when I say years and years, since about the 1940s, right, when Bendix invented power brakes, vacuum power brakes, we've been using vacuum to run our brake systems. And today, with some of our engines, we have to use vacuum pumps. It's kind of another topic for cases where the vacuum gets too low and the booster doesn't work right. But if you have a defective brake booster, it can be a vacuum leak. If you have a defective purge system on your gas tank, it can be a vacuum leak. So you want to look for things, if you're worried about a vacuum leak, you want to look for any place where air can get into that intake manifold without being measured. Your heater and air conditioning system in the car, typically the dampers are driven off of vacuum motors. And so if you're diagnosing an engine, especially with a high idle speed, those are kinds of things you want to look for. If you have that leak, I'm going to talk about MAP sensors in a little bit, but the MAP sensor will read high if you have a vacuum leak. The vacuum will read low because you're letting air in. You're letting air in the back side of the throttle plate here. And so if you had a vacuum gauge on it, the vacuum would be low. Usually, and I just said there are some exceptions, but usually the mixture will end up lean because your mass airflow sensor is trying to measure the air coming in, and back here you're adding air that's not going through the sensor. So the sensor doesn't know that it exists. And so in a normal operating engine, your mass airflow sensor will say, hey, it'll say your operating engine's running at 14.7 pounds of air, and it'll go to the fuel injector and say, give me a pound of fuel to match. Now, it's in grams or it's in milligrams, it's in tiny amounts, but in principle, every bit of air that comes through here has to operate at that 14.7 ratio, where you get 14 pounds of air, you need a pound of fuel. 14 pounds of air, you need a pound of fuel. And if you let 5 pounds of air come in on the back side of the throttle that doesn't go through here, the computer won't send the fuel in to match that air because it doesn't know it exists. Because you're trying to throttle the engine and keep the throttle closed, the idle speed will be higher. So typically, because you're using the throttle to keep the engine slowed down, if you let extra air in, the idle speed will go high. Because you're not necessarily putting in the right amount of fuel, you'll oftentimes get misfires and the engine will run rough. Now, for those of you who are still running carbureted cars, carburetor's really nice. Carburetor's a very sophisticated analog computer that feeds fuel in a mass-air ratio. Pretty cool. Problem is that you have physics of how fuel moves and how air moves, and they get very sophisticated with air bleeds and jets and multiple air bleeds and multiple venturis. I'm not going to go into designing carburetors right now, but carburetors are great. It's a very sophisticated instrument, and they're really pretty nice, but they can't do as much as electronic fuel control can do. You'll have a venturi on the carburetor that feeds fuel, goes past the throttle into your engine, right? And just like a fuel injected engine, if you have a vacuum leak here, either from a gasket, a bad vacuum hose, a brake booster, a purge system, HVAC, you're putting air into the intake manifold without it being measured by the carburetor and without fuel being put in at the optimal mixture. You're going to let air in that doesn't get any fuel added, so the system will become lean. If you had a map sensor in your carbureted engine, and maybe a few that do, if you had a map sensor, it would read high. If you had a vacuum sensor or a vacuum gauge, it would read low because the pressure's coming up here, so you'll have less vacuum. It's going to be lean because you're not feeding it enough fuel, and the idle speed's going to be high because the throttle's not being as effective. Now, in the carbureted days, we could go walk up to the idle mixture screw. You might have a vacuum leak and it's supposed to idle at 650 and it's idling at 800. Well, you go crank the throttle plate back a little bit and you could get it back to 650. But now you got to go, in the olden days, you could go richen up your idle mixture screws and compensate for the fact that you had a vacuum leak. But your engine wouldn't run properly and it would be kind of a band-aid. I'm going back to my mechanical gauge for a minute. Using vacuum for diagnostics and for efficiency, if you could look real close at this gauge, right around here is 20. And let's see, it looks like it's a 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. This is green and it says normal. So your vacuum could be, 20, give or take, was normal idle for a car in the 70s. Here where it's red and it's going around 15, it says, hey, late ignition timing. Because if you didn't have your vacuum advance on, or if you had, most of the cars, until you got in the emissions era of the 70s, where the manufacturers were deliberately retarding timing in order to get emissions in line, then those vacuum numbers would start to drop. But in a pre-emissions car, this was kind of normal. They have some down here for having late valve timing, or something else really wrong in the engine where if you were idling at 10 inches, that's pretty tough, right? So you could use this as understanding, where the car wanted to run. So let's dig into that just a little. So if I'm at idle or I'm at part throttle, say cruising at 60 miles an hour, basic principles with vacuum. The vacuum really is an indicator of the efficiency of the engine at that instant, with all other things being equal. Vacuum is higher when the engine makes more power for a given speed and throttle opening. Higher vacuum means greater efficiency if everything else is equal. If you change gears and you put the engine in a different load state, then the maximum vacuum in that gear would be the most efficient, typically. I mean, today in computerized engines, a lot of them you have fuel economy meters and you can sort of tell, but vacuum was a really good indicator of where things stood. Now, the flip side of having high vacuum is that your engine is pulling against that vacuum, and it's called pumping loss, and it really is the fact that you have vacuum in the first place actually hurts power. It's a paradox of sorts. And that's why in modern engines with EGR or with a lot of cam overlap, with variable cam timing, they'll use cam overlap. You can deliberately, with EGR for example, you can deliberately reduce the engine vacuum in the intake manifold by making the engine appear to run less efficient. But you'll lower the pumping loss and the engine will actually be more efficient, in addition to cutting nitrogen oxides and so forth. But again, general principle is, if your engine's idling at 21 inches of mercury, it's being more efficient than if it's idling at 17. In principle, advanced timing will get you higher vacuum, retarded timing will get you lower vacuum. An aggressive cam, the more aggressive and the more overlap you have, it will drop your vacuum, will reduce your vacuum. And back in the days when I was first starting out in this business, we were working in brakes and we had some power brake boosters on 4-cylinder engines with power brakes that in Rocky Mountains at high altitude, that we were having trouble getting enough vacuum to make them work right. And took some different things to get that vacuum up so there was enough power, or to get a powerful enough brake booster to work with the lower vacuum. In any case, poor engine performance. If your compression is bad, if your valves are leaking, if you have generally poor engine performance, your vacuum will be lower. And at steady speed, going back to my 60 mile an hour comment, your best fuel economy will typically be in the range where your vacuum is the highest. And I'm going to go back here to, I got one of these right here. This is a gauge I've had in my parts box now for many, many years, and you see it goes from 0 to 30. So back in the 1970s and 80s, when fuel was short supply, we couldn't get it, it was being rationed in some cases, it was expensive, I was on a heck of a budget, and we think gas is expensive today, and it is, but I remember when gasoline went to $1 a gallon, and you go, oh, $1 a gallon. Well, $1 a gallon in, say, 1978, when the minimum wage was about $1.60 an hour, that was kind of expensive. And as a college student, so even though I loved performance cars and I had them, it was how do you make it right? And of course, we had the 55 speed limit days, which that was supposed to help you, and it did some. But what I would do is I had this gauge, or one like it, mounted on the dash, kind of above the speedometer and below the, we'll call it the crash pad at the top of the dash. And I could monitor this as I was driving down the road. And first of all, carburetors have a power system in them. And the power system comes in, it depends on the carburetor, but they typically come in around 6, 7, 8 inches of mercury. And so I had a self-imposed limit of about 10. So even in my old Mustang, that thing would come away from a light pretty good, but I always kept my vacuum above 10 inches. Didn't wind it out too far. It was a means of keeping out of the throttle, keeping the vacuum above 10 so that it didn't go into power system, even if I was kind of stepping off the line quickly. If I was going down the road at, say, 60 miles an hour, the police, they'd really go after you for breaking 55 some days. It just depended. My cars, typically the way they were geared, And I kept track of fuel mileage, right? I mean, I've got a logbook. I've still got them tucked away somewhere. And so I would drive on the highway to try to optimize the vacuum. The cars run about 19 or 20 inches of mercury at 60 miles an hour, give or take. I actually found that, you know, my 351 Mustang, it liked about 65, 66 miles an hour was about peak vacuum. When you back down to 55, 57, 58, the vacuum actually dropped off. And if I went and measured, you know, went on a highway trip and I measured the fuel economy, it correlated. It was a pretty good match. It's not perfect, but hey, for the tools of the day, you know, for an inexpensive gauge hooked into the intake manifold to read vacuum, this was great. I had a 455 Ols. I put one of these on 455 Ols, and it was kind of the same thing. You know, its best economy was around 65-ish. It wasn't at 55, and you could pick that out off of the vacuum gauge. And again, logbook confirmed it. It was a pretty good answer. All right, I said I'd talk about MAP, manifold absolute pressure. Why do we use MAP sensors? Why don't we use vacuum sensors? Well, the main reason is that MAP, manifold absolute pressure, from people who are programming computers, engine controllers, MAP is better than vacuum because it compensates for weather. If the barometric pressure is high, if it's low, if you go up a mountain, MAP tells you what the air pressure is in the intake manifold, and that air pressure is going into the cylinder and feeding the cylinder and being fed fuel. And so it's a better number to read the absolute pressure than it is to read the vacuum. Atmospheric pressure is around 15 pounds of 30 inches, and MAP measures the numbers on this scale. If you had a turbocharged engine with, you know, so many pounds of boost, you know, you'd be above atmospheric pressure. You know, an idling engine, I'm going to say here, we've got, this is where things, I talked about the coin being one side or the other, right? So I'm at 30 inches of mercury atmosphere. My engine's running at 20 inches of vacuum, right? 30 minus 10 is 20. So my engine is running at 10 inches absolute. 5 psi, 10 inches absolute. The vacuum is higher, the vacuum is 20. And so when you go to wide open throttle, your vacuum drops to close to atmospheric. The MAP sensor will think that the pressure has gone up. So it's just the opposite, right? If you said vacuum, a perfect vacuum will be down here at 0 inches of mercury or 0 psi. That's 30 inches of vacuum when you come down to the bottom. On my little gauge up here, if it read 30, which it would never run 30, but if you're running a manual transmission and you stick it in low gear and you tack it up and close the throttle, you'll pull 25, 26, 27 while you're, you know, running downhill. That would be down here at a very low absolute pressure. So, you know, you're just flipping the scale upside down. Again, I'm just going to repeat it one more time. You're flipping the scale upside down, so 30 inches of vacuum is down here, 30 inches of absolute pressure is up here. The two just like flip upside down. The difference is that vacuum is connected to where atmospheric pressure is today. And if you had a bad weather day and the barometer drops, then your whole vacuum scale will drop. Your absolute pressure doesn't care. It'll measure whatever the absolute pressure is and give you the correct answer for the barometric pressure that you're working with, and and using that you can get a better, more precise fuel mixture and altitude compensation and so forth for making your modern engine run on emissions and power and so forth. So that's my story on vacuum, and I hope that helps you understand, where do we get it, why do we have it, what's it good for, and so that as you're working on your engines, you have a little better understanding of what you're up against. So I hope that helps, and that's all for now.